Welcome to our afternoon session on network attacks. I apologize for the brief delay there. We had to switch batteries on the mic, but we are all ready to go now. So hopefully you're ready to go through this afternoon session and then get to work on your afternoon labs. I trust that you're enjoying the training and the experience of getting to go through the labs. The labs are designed to make you think about the application of the particular subject. So some labs are designed that they basically feed you all the commands and have you type exactly whatever input you need to have in order to get a specific result. But these labs actually make you go through the thought process of what you need to discover, what you need to find in order to be able to come up with the right answer. So I actually like that part of these labs, in that you have to think through how they're presented and the material in order to be able to come up with the right command on or in your lab environment. There were a couple of questions this morning in regard to how long you would have access to the lab materials. So the lab environments will probably, they will actually be torn down on Friday afternoon. And so you can actually access the VMs through Friday. And then the YouTube content, the recordings that we're doing for each live session, those will be available using the link and will remain available forever. So with that, there will be no delay for us to talk about network attacks. A very fun subject to talk about, but definitely very comprehensive. So when we think about network attacks, I just want you to think through this with me for a brief second. You see the topics on the screen: indicators of attack, covert channels, exfiltration, packet injection, ARP attacks, DNS attacks. And these were basically chosen to give you specific information for what you'll see in the lab environment. But please bear in mind that on the subject of network attacks, we could probably talk all week, maybe even 2 weeks on the subject of network attacks alone. So when you think of the network and what we discussed yesterday as the different layers of the OSI, every single protocol that's available at every layer, including the human layer of social engineering attacks, are available or vulnerable to attack. So every network protocol, that would be ARP and specific to layer 2, the IP protocol, how I can exploit the IP header, the TCP protocol, the UDP protocol, and then moving up to the upper layers such as HTTP and DNS and DHCP and all the different protocols available. If they're software, they present vulnerabilities. If they're hardware, there could be specific hardware exploits that I could run on those devices. So basically, you have to have all things considered here when you talk about the scope of network attacks. Again, we've just isolated a few of these topics in order to go over for a session today. Yesterday, we brought up the subject of indicators of attack. And when we talk specifically about indicators of attack, they're going to focus more on the why and the intent of an actor. So we're trying to get into, like Sarah talked about this in this morning's session, the hacker mindset. What specifically is the hacker after? And I think sometimes we underestimate our adversary in terms of how long they're willing to wait to get after their target, or to actually capture or get their hands on intellectual property, or to capture some sort of sensitive information. So in terms of flying low and staying for a long period of time, they pretty much have this mastered. They're very patient in terms of performing each attack in a stealthy manner in order to stay off of the radar. So some of the things that we'll talk about today specifically deal with those tactics, techniques, and procedures. So when we discuss indicators of attack, we have to look specifically at anything that's going on after hours. If there is a high volume of traffic on the weekend, that should definitely get someone's attention and raise the suspicious flags to look more in depth at that particular activity to determine if it is the start of an attack or if someone is actually profiling places in the network in order to be able to craft a specific exploit for a specific target. Sarah talked in depth this morning about network scans. That should be alarming. You should look for those, and you should actually have that as an indicator of an attack. Actually, it should be on the someone's mind that this is something I need to pay attention to, and if it's just a one-time hit and miss, then that's very different than it's happening repeatedly. So you want to look for this, when it started, what they were specifically scanning for. It may have been just a brief periodic scan to find out what was available, what was vulnerable, in order to look for a specific vulnerability for a specific target. You also have to think about remote logins and what protocols you have available for remote logins. Be aware of the vulnerabilities in things like Microsoft's remote desktop. If you have high levels of email protocols, then that could be indicative of some sort of exfiltration attack. There's also a lot of fraudulent transactions that are coming in via email, especially if you have many third parties integrated into your organization. Then they are actually trying to get people who work in billing accounts and things of that nature to divert funds to malicious actors who are trying to act or emulate third-party companies. We talked briefly yesterday about unusual DNS queries and the amount of DNS traffic, and we'll talk again about that at the end of our lecture today. Unusual traffic outbound. We often consider and map out our approach to security by thinking of it in terms of a secure perimeter. And when I first started in this field, that was our area of concentration, was to secure the network perimeter. But of course, as time has evolved, the level of thinking and sophistication of our threat actors has increased to the point where they know not to just attack the network, that they're actually going after web applications and attacking in the upper layer protocols. So you may have heard, and we may have talked about it in one of our sessions, we used to have packet filtering and access control lists and all of these mechanisms that actually work to filter traffic at the network. But now we're having to deploy next generation firewalls and email security appliances and web security appliances, all because we have to have the ability to conduct deep packet analysis inside the packets because the sophistication of the threat actors has increased and they're not exploiting anything at layer 3 or layer 4, but actually the protocols that we're using in our applications. Another indicator of attack would be an anomalous user login or account use. So most organizations have a policy on dormant accounts or orphan accounts and how those accounts are treated. But basically there should be a a policy with HR inside your organization that as soon as an employee leaves, their account is immediately terminated and no longer used. So that account is locked and unable to use if it's not deleted forever. But you have to pay attention to if someone has gained elevated privileges and again want to fly under the radar and not create suspicion, they may create some sort of anonymous user that no one would recognize. They don't know that that particular user isn't part of the organization. So actually doing account auditing for employees in the organization is a good idea to actually discover and maybe find this particular IOA. There's also the size of responses for HTML. So the typical HTML response averages between 200K, and if it grows in size to something like 50 megs perhaps, then this is something that you want to look into deeper. That should definitely cause suspicion and raise some red flags for you to say, hey, something's not going on here, or something's going on here, something's not right, and I want to look at the actual server logs for this particular server, or look in SQL database, because it could be that you are vulnerable to some sort of SQL injection for their pulling information out of your relational database, or actually tunneling data or including data inside your HTML responses. If you've got a high number of requests for the same files, that should also raise the red flag. We talked yesterday about non-standard ports and application mismatch. So we should never have the simple mail transfer protocol with a UDP port. And we actually said that if we were capturing packets, we could see the application port mismatch. Those packets would actually be identified in black inside our Wireshark analyzer. And then of course the use of non-standard ports. Looking for those ports that lackadaisical hackers have used and programmed their malicious software to respond to things that just fall out of the profile of normal that we've established from our network baseline. Of course, if any program is altering our registry or save perhaps our System32 files, that we should look into that further, because any altering of the registry could be indicative of some rootkit installation. And rootkit installations are typically not detected by any antivirus software, anti-malware software. You actually have to have specific tool to find that a rootkit has embedded itself into the registry. Unexpected, unusual patching. So most organizations, and if you don't, I would say this would be a good time to start, have specific maintenance windows. Now these specific maintenance windows are designed so that the normal day-to-day operation is not interrupted, but also these maintenance windows are designed so that people know when to look at activity as suspicious. So say in the middle of the day, you got your computer needs to restart, we have some sort of critical patch to push. Well, this falls outside of the profile of that normal maintenance window. And maybe, for instance, your organization sends out an email prior to a critical vulnerability or a critical patch for a vulnerability. So if that's the case, you didn't get that email, the procedure wasn't fully followed, and it looks like that process is being circumvented, then that is in and of itself an indicator of attack. Any unusual tasks, and this could be any and everything, it's really just It's kind of like when after the 9/11 attack and when people just started paying attention to everything around them, when backpacks were left in an airport unattended and in various different places, you just really had your sensors up looking for things that were unusual. And anything that was unusual, you wanted to report that. Well, anything that's unusual in terms of network behavior, you really have to keep your senses up and operate as if paranoia is your friend. You want to do that to a healthy perspective or to a healthy degree, because there's some good that can come out of that. But what we talked about yesterday, the average organization is going to fall victim to some sort of an attack, and we have to be prepared for that. So if we're proactive in thinking that it's going to occur and having that lean forward mentality with how we protect ourselves, then that is certainly something we want to do. So I have to give Sarah credit for finding this particular GIF. She's like the queen of GIFs and memes here in the Cyber Center. And I just think this one and that one this morning with the hacker going crazy with the banana, and I don't know if you were distracted as I was listening to her talk, but that was very, very funny. So covert channels. A covert channel, by definition, these channels exist in software by design. So we want these covert channels to exist, but we do not want them to be found and used by attackers for nefarious purposes. But does that happen? Unfortunately, yes. So by definition, a covert channel is a way that we can communicate information in a manner that is hiding or disguising that communication, and really no one knows that that channel even exists. So different types of ways that we can establish covert channels, and steganography in and of itself is a type of covert channel. If you've never heard of steganography, it's basically a way to hide a file within a file. So inside that file, I may have a specific message, and there's actually some documentation, and I'm going to post that in your class after class today, and after we're done fielding all of the help calls in the live chat, I'll go back and actually add that to your Canvas course so that you can have some good Wednesday night reading. But excuse me one second. There's an article by Sands that talks about steganography being used by terrorists on different websites. So the terrorist organizations would sign in to a specific website, and unbeknownst to anybody except the ones that had that information, that other information, secret information, was hidden on a web page. So steganography is often confused with cryptography, and they are not the same. They are very different. Steganography is a way to hide information in plain sight, while cryptography is saying we know that data was sent between a sender and receiver, but that data was hidden. That data was, if captured, was unreadable. But steganography gives no indication that any information was actually sent or shared between two parties. And there are many tools that you can use in order to create or hide or create a steganographic file or steganographic file. Sorry, I missed some syllables there. I think OpenPuff is one of those tools. There are many tools that you can actually use to create this, but you can hide data inside an audio file. You can hide data inside a picture. You can hide data inside of video. And so you do this by actually changing the pixels in, say for instance, if you were using a picture, changing the pixels or changing the data that's part of the least significant bit. Because the higher you go in the bit order, the more obvious it is that that picture has been altered. So staying in the storing data in the least significant bits of each pixel makes that picture look unchanged in terms of the naked eye viewing it. That's why you want to have some sort of tool that looks for this type of data hiding in pictures, hiding in music files, hiding in video files. We also, a problem that we have in networks today, and as Sarah talked about this morning, we know what normal is in our network in terms of what is the normal traffic we expect to see. Well, definitely HTTP, our web traffic, HTTPS, the domain name service protocol, possibly ICMP, SSH, VPN traffic. Well, as attackers are trying to, the hacker mindset is to fly under the radar and go undetected and stay infiltrated in your network as long as possible, then they're going to try to exploit whatever you consider normal. So they may exfiltrate data or poison specific protocols in order to exfiltrate data using these protocols, or actually launch man-in-the-middle attack using these specific protocols. And we'll look at examples of these coming up. The header modulation is where you have the least significant bit of the IP ID or the type of service bit that we talked about on yesterday. It could also use any non-critical bit. And this has a net yield of 1 bit per packet, and it's fairly inefficient use for many cases, so you don't see this particular exploit or this particular covert channel used a lot. Header manipulation is using the IP ID field, and this IP ID field is a randomly generated ID on many systems, and therefore could very easily be crafted by an attacker and replace it or use it to represent any ASCII or other types of data. There's also protocols that carry data fields, and these data fields can be used by an attacker to store data of their own. Say for instance, the ICMP protocol has a default data channel available that's typically used for the round trip timer and calculation and storage in storing the timing information for the round trip timer in the ICMP protocol. However, you can actually use that, an attacker can use that to actually write hex data to that data portion of the ICMP packet using the -P switch. So I'm just going to show you that real quick. I'm going to switch into the lab environment. Give me just 1 second to refresh my screen here. And it's very simple. When the machine comes up, I'm going to turn on Wireshark on the machine so you can actually see the packet. Well, maybe I won't. Let me just close all these windows. Okay, so on screen here you see I just have a command terminal open, and I'm going to turn on Wireshark. And have it capture on the ENS3 adapter where we are receiving traffic for this specific VM. Then in another terminal window, for Wireshark is running here, so I'm just going to open another terminal window. And using the ping command, so of course ICMP uses the ping utility, which we consider to be a layer 3 utility because ICMP is a layer 3 protocol. I'm going to ping Google's Open DNS Server 8.8.8, and using that -P option, I'm going to store data in that data channel. So the specification we talked about on the previous slide was it could be data that was hex. So I'm going to use dead beef, which are all hexadecimal digits here. So as Sarah talked about earlier, because this is a Linux box, oh, never mind, that's not something I want to point out here. Just a second, I'm going to stop this. So we've sent enough data. We're going to go back to our Wireshark and look at our ICMP. So we have our ICMP ping request and our ICMP echo reply. So anytime there is, you're allowing any echo reply, then you're vulnerable to someone using this covert channel. So that's something that you definitely need to be aware of. And if you want to use ping inside your internal network, that's one thing, but what you allow on the outside and the echo replies that you allow out of your network, you definitely need to make strong consideration in how you're creating your rules concerning this, because any echo reply is going to allow this covert channel to exist, and then you're vulnerable to the storage of this hexadecimal data. And I also encourage you to go read about the low-key exploit, which is specific exfiltration of data using ICMP in this data section. So if I look here at the data and go down to the actual Internet Control Message Protocol, I can already see down in the payload area where that dead beef was actually sent as part of the hex. So these are all hexadecimal digits that we see here. And if you look, I can actually see that that information was sent. So if I have data that's encoded as hex that I actually want to transmit to a specific location using the ping utility, then that's what we just demonstrated. Data exfiltration. So data infiltration, of course, is bringing something in. Typically, that's some sort of malicious software, something that's not supposed to be there. And a lot of times we actually think, as long as I am keeping the bad guys out, I've created a secure perimeter, and I feel very confident that there is a wall of fire that exists around everything I value, all of my critical assets inside my network. But that's not a correct mentality, because if you think about the way I think about this is, if you build a castle by design was constructed to keep the enemy out of the castle. But it never made the consideration about what if someone on the inside is working for the bad guys. So this doesn't necessarily take into consideration an insider threat, or it doesn't take into consideration someone who has gained access to an account on the inside that has escalated privileges. So if someone gains access to a system and then gains access to an account that has escalated privileges, they have access to data. Maybe it's credit card information associated with your customers, and they are just steadily exfiltrating this data out. And you're none the wiser, because the only thing you're thinking about is, I'm keeping the bad guys from coming in. But what if, by some reason of compromise, they were already in, and you're not really examining your outbound connections to look for data exfil in specific protocols like HTTP or HTTPS. And one thing that I didn't mention is one of the things that we use to hide our data and make it unreadable to attackers is encryption. So what did the attackers start doing? Okay, you want to hide your data from me? Well, I'm going to hide my actions from you in the same way. So they started to set up HTTPS and configure HTTPS and actually encrypt their actions so that it made them harder to detect, and they could actually evade detection of an IPS or IDS system. So most common methods of data exfil that you should be familiar with are using the HTTP, whether this be header manipulation or HTTPS in trying to evade your security appliances. DNS, so the normal functionality of a DNS query, a DNS update, DNS messaging, all of these messages used as part of DNS and the DNS records have been exploited by attackers. The FTP protocol, RDP, remote desktop, SMTP, the simple mail transfer protocol, and email, other email like POP3 and IMAP, SNMB. There are, if you would actually look in the Metasploit framework, there's a ton of exploits associated with the SNMB protocol, and of course Tor. And if you're not familiar with Tor, Tor is the what they call the onion browser, because it actually sends your data anonymously through a network of Tor relays, and your actual IP address and associated data is hidden, and therefore to basically allow you to remain undetected. Techniques to help obfuscate your data exfiltration can include compressing the data, so hiding that in some sort of zip file, chunking the data, encoding the data, or encryption of the data. Okay, let's talk about packet injection. First, I'll take the time to actually define what we mean by packet injection. Sarah talked about a tool this morning that could be used to craft packets, and that was the Scapy tool. And basically, anytime you forge a packet or spoof a packet, meaning you're taking on the identity of some existent host inside the network, then you are crafting packets. And packet injection is where we take those then crafted packets and insert them into an established connection in order to disrupt any normal communication process. So this attacker or third party intercepts packets from any consenting parties that are communicating, and basically their goal is to disrupt this communication in some shape, form, or fashion. This is also using this packet injection method It can also be referred to as a man-in-the-middle attack, and can also be used because it is disrupting the communication stream, can be considered a denial of service attack. Any packet injection tool use packet protocols that may include ICMP, TCP, UDP, and many others that allow you to gain full packet header control when you're building and crafting that packet. As Sarah talked about earlier, it's not as easy as it sounds, because the actual procedure involves several network elements to be established, and that is the creation of a raw socket, an Ethernet header, an IP header, a TCP header. All this, whatever protocols you're establishing in this packet crafting, you have to build all those headers and then of course append it to your data. The injection tool will then have the ability to calculate the necessary checksums in order for it to operate as a normal packet inside your network. So many packet injection tools are actually used by hackers for malicious purposes. They may have the goal of trying to disrupt any core service that's part of a wireless environment using access points or internet service providers. It could be to interrupt a file transfer process used in file sharing, or the HTTP browsing protocol. Packet injectors can also be used by gamers online to find and locate and then exploit a vulnerability and manipulate the functionalities of the game. So it could be used in terms to cheat and make it through different levels. So not all of packet injectors are considered bad. This particular example, Comcast was found guilty of using packet injectors to send ads, basically for their Comcast Xfinity. And I thought this was so funny when I was looking at this and just trying to find something interesting to share with you. The Comcast spokesperson actually said, "We think it's a courtesy and it helps address some concerns that people might not be absolutely sure they're on a hotspot from Comcast." So it would come up and say, you know, you're on Xfinity Wi-Fi network. And so the author of this particular article that I was reading, it was from 2014, and he said, so let me get this straight. It's a courtesy to hijack a page a person asked for, insert something that no one asked for. No, I don't think that's a courtesy. So there's a reason that packet injection is actually considered an attack. And I thought this was so prevalent that he made this statement that you shouldn't have that authority, you shouldn't have that right. You're providing a service, and your service is to retrieve the packets from the network, from the wire, and play them as they are received. You shouldn't have the right, and it does make you wonder if they're doing some sort of packet injection, are they also doing packet capture and spying on data? You know, it just opens a can of worms for you to think, well, can I really trust the ISP in this case? So there's a reason that packet injection is considered an attack and a security risk, and it's got nothing to do with courtesy. So, you know, just putting that back in perspective, and I found this awesome meme is, so on behalf of the Comcast spokesperson, oh, that's a good way to spin that. Okay, a courtesy. So another protocol that is required for us to use, and I'll say required with kind of, for now anyway, is the ARP protocol. And let me just give you some background on ARP in case you're unaware. ARP is the Address Resolution Protocol. It has the responsibility to resolve an unknown layer 2 address to a known IP address. And ARP is the ARP protocol is broadcast natured by default, and it is a broadcast transmission, and broadcast transmissions are contained to a local area network, meaning that they are not sent across a router. A router serves as a firewall for any broadcast. So each device, whether we're talking about a host device or a switch or a router, all of these devices actually keep ARP caches that have the answer to whatever the respective IP address is to the layer 2 MAC address. This information is stored in the cache so that I do not have to ask that same question every single time. I can just refer to the cache and see if that translation has already been provided or that resolution has already been provided, and then just use that in building out my transmission request. So if an attacker, typically in this particular type of attack, the attacker has gained local access to your network. Because this is, of course, an attack on a local area network, then we're assuming that our attacker has gained some sort of physical access here. So it's a type of attack which an attacker sends the falsified ARP messages over a local area network. So I want to insert myself in between the communication of the sender and receiver, basically so all the communication from specific users will actually be diverted to the attacker's machine so that the attacker can spy on the information that's been sent. It gives him a way to circumvent firewall rules and circumvent authentication, and basically he becomes someone else or takes on the identity of someone else in terms of layer 2 MAC addresses in order to receive that traffic. I apologize, I didn't realize that this particular view on this slide was so blurry. So hopefully you'll be able to follow along with me, but this host, host A, has been given an IP address of 10.1.1.2 with a MAC address, and of course the MAC addresses are shortened for the purpose of this example. We know that MAC addresses are 48-bit hexadecimal notations, and they are unique to every physical device that has an Ethernet interface. So every Ethernet interface has a unique 48-bit hexadecimal address associated with it. So this host, 10.1.1.2, has a MAC address of quad A here. And he sends out an ARP request for the MAC address of 10.1.1.1. Now, if you remember yesterday when we talked about encapsulation, we said that it was a downward process. So basically at layer 3, when I have determined as a host that I want to talk to this 10.1.1 recipient, I can't send that communication out until I have resolved what the layer 2 address is for that device if the communication is local. If it's remote, then there's a different process that happens altogether. I'm actually going to receive the MAC address of the router that's going to forward that communication to a remote network. So the response happens. Let me find, okay. So the response is sent. The legitimate ARP reply is sent from router C here. He says, hi, I'm 10.1.1.1 and this is my MAC address, all C's. So typically what would happen is host A would then store that communication inside their ARP table. But our attacker has positioned himself, remember this is a type of man-in-the-middle attack, he's positioned himself in the middle of this communication, and he has sent gratuitous ARP replies. Gratuitous ARP replies simply means he's sending a series of replies. So any legitimate ARP replies sent by device C in this case are going to be overwritten in the table, in the ARP table of host A. And what is the gratuitous reply? So attacker B here in this case is saying, I am the 10.1.1.1, and that IP address is bound to the MAC of all Bs. So what just happened in doing this? The attacker allowed, or excuse me, he hijacked the communication that was supposed to be sent to router C in this case. So any communication that is now, you see what's stored in host A, any communication destined for 10.1.1.1, which is typically the router gateway here, is now going to be sent to the attacker's machine. Now the attacker could then craft and forward that packet to router C so that this interception remains undetected for as long as possible. So it could just be a way that he could sit and capture traffic, almost like you're doing if wireless network is bleeding outside of the organization and you have someone that's sitting in the parking lot. So this happened a lot with the point of sale terminals inside like self-checkouts with Walmarts. You had guys that had specific tools that would sit inside the PAN, the personal area network of that particular device operation, and they would have a collecting device that were basically sending all the credit card information, PIN information to a device that particular individual was in possession of. And this is because they actually put their own, and I'm kind of going off subject here, I'm sorry, but they would take their own point of sales terminal and it would fit over the top of the point of sale terminals in the self-checkout aisles. And most of the self-checkout places, they don't actually monitor those point of sale terminals. So it's very easily just to go snap that on, and then if you don't know that this type of attack is possible, then you just go, you know, scan your credit card, put in your information, and all that is being sent out to someone who's capturing it in the parking lot or in that little bitty McDonald's that normally sits by, you know, or the Starbucks, like if a Target has Starbucks and Walmart normally has a McDonald's or whatever. They're sitting right there just capturing all that information. So this is an example of ARP spoofing. And now we'll talk about, if you do have a lab, I will take the opportunity to tell you that you have a lab that has you go through ARP spoofing today. So now let's talk about DNS. DNS is the Domain Name System Protocol. It's the protocol that makes our life easy. And it reminds me of like right now, if you were to ask me people's phone numbers of people that I call regularly, of course I know my husband's number, I know my children's number, but there are other people that are kind of in my circle that if you ask me their phone number, I'm not going to know it. I just know that the contact is stored in my phone, and that phone, when I hit the contact, is actually making that translation to the phone number, right? That's providing me that service. I don't have to remember the number. Well, DNS is like that for the internet. We don't have to remember the actual IP address of that particular node, that web server that we want to browse to on the internet. DNS is providing that translation for us. We're using some specific URL to navigate to that site, and then DNS is actually providing that translation. So with that, we have to ask the question, well, it's a necessary service that we have to use in our networks, it's not something that's going away in anytime soon. So what is the threat to DNS? So I'm just going to give you some quick stats so that you can see that there really is a threat. In one of the most recent Cisco annual security reports, they reported that 91% of malware used DNS. 91% of malware used DNS. 68% of security professionals report that the organizations do not monitor DNS activities. Okay, well, maybe we should have put that bullet first, right? Because maybe that's why 91% of malware uses DNS, because it's not being monitored. It's not being looked at because there we go again, it's normal. It's something that we're supposed to see. So to make situations even worse, Cisco, through retrospective investigation into DNS queries, so after there's been some sort of indicators of compromise that point to a specific attack, and this has been investigated and validated, they go back and look at the DNS queries, and they were able to determine and uncover rogue DNS resolvers in use on customer networks. So these rogue DNS resolvers were still in play on customer networks. So definitely a problem with using DNS and something that we have to get ahead of. Of course, there's lots of tools today with OpenDNS and Cisco Umbrella and Bind and other utilities that can actually help us secure DNS. But you know, one of the things that we have to do better is actually monitoring the communication of DNS through our environments. So in order to really get to the heart of the problem with DNS, we're just going to do some background on DNS operation. So I don't know if you've ever heard of an open DNS resolver. A few minutes ago I pinged to the 8.8.8.8, and that is a Google open resolver. It is a DNS server and it's used by Google. So if I were sitting at a machine and I were to reach out to a specific URL, chances are that DNS query is going to be sent to what we call a recursive resolver. And that recursive resolver may have the information that I have requested cached in their local machine. So my box, my personal box that I sent that query from, I also have a cache. I have a local DNS cache that I can resolve URLs to IP addresses and store that locally. So if I'm actually checking that local DNS cache first, then that would resolve on my local machine and I wouldn't have to contact a DNS server on the internet. But there are other recursive resolvers that exist, like I gave you the example of Google. So I'm going to make that request to Google as a recursive resolver. They're going to look in their cache and say, oh no, I don't have the translation for that particular website, and they're going to forward that request out to an authoritative name server. So an authoritative name server is going to be the one that actually speaks to that particular translation. And understand that there is a hierarchy of domain servers, and there's different zones of these domain servers that exist across the globe. So it could be that you have to contact a DNS server that's in another country. So what happens in this process is that particular request has a unique ID name or a unique identification, and it's typically a number. And so while your request is out to an authoritative name server and we're waiting on the response from the name server, an attacker could actually send a spam flood of DNS replies that says send that traffic to the attacker machine in this case. So if he's able to, and in those spam responses, he basically has to get lucky and guess the specific ID that was used in the original DNS query. So if they capture some of those packets for long enough, then it's very easy to determine what that particular ID would be. And then they send like a host of, you know, starting at 1,000 to possibly 1,050 in order to be able to, you know, possibly hit the right one. So the problem with this is that once that answer comes back from the attacker machine and saying, send that traffic to me, I'm the IP address to resolve that particular URL to. Now the attacker, as well as the recursive resolver, has that information stored where? In their cache. And caches, typically for recursive resolvers, don't clear for days, like up to 30 days. So this is definitely a problem that you could have with poisoning the DNS cache. You have to be careful with any public DNS system in order to not have your DNS system taken over, and you want to be able to block traffic to known websites that have malware, botnets, excuse me, or to websites that are luring people there for phishing purposes. So these open DNS resolvers, as previously stated, are vulnerable to multiple malicious activities. So the cache poisoning is one that we mentioned. There's also the DNS amplification and reflection attack. It could be that DNS is vulnerable to a resource utilization attack. So basically we want to attack the availability of that DNS server's ability to respond. So attackers leverage the fact that both an authoritative or non-authoritative server could respond to that DNS query. So the resource record is one of the records used by DNS, and it actually has a 32-bit time to live value, which is going to inform the resolver, it's going to inform the resolver on how long the resource record may be cached until the resolver needs to resend the DNS query. And attackers can actually change this value inside the resource record and reset the value to a shorter or longer TTL value that matches their intent. I mentioned briefly the DNS reflection and amplification attack. This is in essence a DDoS attack, a distributed denial of service attack, and it uses spoofed requests in order to overwhelm a target with replies. So in this, an attacker delivers traffic to the victim by reflecting it from some specific third party. So I am hiding the identity of the real attacker in this case. So the attacker is going to use an open DNS resolver as a reflector, and this is where the reflection part of the attack comes is we're using the open resolver as the reflector in order to increase the volume of the attack and then hide the true source. The attackers send that spoofed DNS query message to the open DNS resolver that has some sort of forged IP address to the target. And from there, the open DNS server responds by sending DNS response messages To magnify this attack, which comes in on the amplification part of the definition here, the attacker uses multiple DNS open resolvers. So if you were managing the enterprise network, you can reduce the chance of any kind of DNS amplification attack in such a way that any upstream provider that you're talking to filters packets entering their network from downstream customers, and that you are discarding any packets that have an IP source address that doesn't belong to any of your customers. The resource utilization attack is actually, in some way, shape, form, or fashion consuming the resources of that open DNS resolver. We could be talking about the CPU resources, memory, or any socket buffers. So you want to make sure, because DNS is not a protocol we've already established that can be turned off, that you have some preventive measures against these types of attacks. Multiple vendors have products that implement the DNS protocol that can be configured, allow your open resolvers to be configured, whether you want that intentionally. Some people actually want their boxes to be like Google, perhaps they want theirs to be an open resolver, but maybe for your organization you don't want that. But some people inadvertently have theirs public and they're not aware of that fact. So I included this slide. It really reiterates what we talked about earlier. And most attackers who are targeting DNS, they have what's called domain generation algorithms to quickly generate these random domains. So if you see queries that actually have any hexadecimal numbers appended to the domain, or any random generation of names and characters, you have to pay attention to that. Remember, if we go back to our original problem here, 68% of security professionals report that organizations do not monitor their DNS activities. So the only way you're going to see this is if you are monitoring, right? You're looking for these malicious subdomains, and when this information has poisoned a cache, that's basically how they leverage this for a long period of time. Is once those entries are cached, then you're kind of just in limbo until you can get this cache cleared and flushed. The last part of this is, this was actually a really cool gift that I was so happy about showing you, but I couldn't make it work before we started because we were so busy in the chats and here and there and everywhere. But yesterday we talked about, and Sarah talked about again today, just to reiterate, a TCP send flood attack. Today you have a lab called TCP/IP, and for those of you who are taking naps while I'm talking, this is a good time for you to wake up, because you're going to have lots of questions on this particular lab. So I'm going to tell you up front that it is not going to work as it is supposed to. Okay, you heard that? I know it doesn't work, but I made the decision for you to go ahead and use this lab because the value of what you will see with sending the actual synchronization requests, altering the buffer. So the idea of this particular lab in the first part of it was you were going to send a number of synchronization packets to a server to overwhelm the server. You're going to modify the buffer, and it was going to create an attack on availability for this particular box. And then you're going to go into NetStat and do the analysis on this, on these send packets. You're going to look at how they're different from a TCP established session. and look in NetStat the specific way these packets are coded and represented. That is the value of this lesson, okay? If you don't have experience with that, that is something you definitely want to learn how to recognize. Just altering the buffer, knowing how the buffer's altered, how to check to see if the buffer's been altered to allow for this particular type of attack. All these things are valuable, even though you will never overwhelm the server to the point that it becomes unavailable, which is the actual, payload or action on objective. There is still much value in this lecture or in this lab. With that, make sure you go through, there are multiple parts to it. So we have our ARP spoofing lab, you have a local DNS lab, and a TCP/IP lab. If you're not familiar with these protocols, this is your opportunity to become more familiar with them. What are attackers attacking? Of course, they're attacking humans, but they're using the protocols that we're running on our network. So the more familiar you are with the operation of these protocols and the fundamental mechanics of them, the better you can, the better opportunity you'll have to locate and find any suspicious or nefarious operation going on. So with that, I will go on mute briefly so I can determine what questions you may have asked during the lecture, and then I'll be right back. So give me just a moment, please.
Also, Nassim asked about DNSSEC.
Okay, so one thing that I'll actually go over is, I lost my train of thought, and it was just that quick. I just got the information. So there's an advanced lab that you can do today as well. I forgot to mention there is a Metasploitable lab. That is included in your Canvas course. And basically, if you've never used the Metasploitable framework, and you don't know how you look for vulnerabilities and exploits are actually crafted, then this is a great time to play in the virtual sandbox that you have created as part of the cyber range. And you don't have to worry about hurting anything. You can play till your heart is content using this Metasploitable lab. So basically, it's going to give you the revelation of, oh my gosh, I didn't realize this was so easy. And there are many things using these tools that are scary easy, if that is proper English, and I don't think it is. The other thing is OpenDNS. Someone had a question about OpenDNS.
DNSSEC.
Oh, sorry. DNSSEC. So basically, this is DNS implemented with the secure factor. And I'll send you some specific information on this. I'll add it to the Canvas course so that you'll have that, and you can review that once you complete your labs or in conjunction with your labs. So I think that clears up all of our afternoon questions. I really want to give you the opportunity to maximize your time performing these labs. As always, our live chat rooms will be open. So Sarah and I have been working furiously in these rooms between the two of us, and Chris Apsey in the Cyber Range room, trying to field all of your questions. We do have to take potty breaks, so if there is a delay in answering any of your questions, just be patient with us, and we will be right back to take your questions. We typically leave at 5 o'clock every afternoon, so I wouldn't expect to have any questions fielded past the 5 o'clock hour. but feel free to send your question over email. And Sarah and I are famous for, you know, taking an email and at 8 o'clock or something. We might see it, we might not. But we will get to it the next morning right away when we come in. So we appreciate your patience in regard to that. With that, I'd like to close and say good afternoon to you. I hope you all enjoy your afternoon working through these labs, and we will see you again tomorrow morning for our last session, and we look forward to it. Thank you.